The town called itself Divinity, a name carved into a weathered plank at its edge, a promise of holiness it had never earned. At the heart of Divinity stood the church, a white timber frame structure with a steeple that stabbed at the vast, empty blue of the sky like a finger of judgment. It was in the shadow of that steeple that the town's divinity showed its true face. Tiva didn't know the town's name. To her, it was just a place of hostile eyes and venomous whispers. She had come seeking help, a desperate pilgrimage fueled by the fading memory of her mother and the single object she clutched for reassurance, a smooth, cool river stone hanging from a leather thong around her neck. Reverend Gideon Thorne, a man with a face as sharp as a hawk's and eyes that burned with zealous fire, led the charge. He had cornered Tiva against the wall of the general store, his righteousness a cloak for his naked cruelty. "The devil's own charm," he roared, pointing at the amulet. He lunged, his fingers like talons, and snatched it. The leather thongs snapped. Tiva cried out, a sharp gasp of loss, as the stone fell to the dust. Thorne planted his boot on it, grinding it into the dirt. "Behold the mark of the devil," he proclaimed. "She comes to poison our souls." Tiva did not flinch, her gaze fixed on Thorne's eyes, a silent challenge that infuriated him more than any plea for mercy. Then, the heavy oak doors of the church creaked open. A hush fell over the crowd as Caleb Blackwood appeared on the threshold, a tall, gaunt figure framed by the light within. He stepped out into the harsh sun, his wooden cane tapping softly on the steps. His sightless, milky eyes were aimed in the direction of the commotion. He could not see the girl, nor the preacher, nor the stolen amulet, but he could smell. What drifted on the hot, dusty air was something that sliced through years of grief and struck him like a physical blow. It was the faint, almost imperceptible scent of crushed juniper berries. It was Grace's scent, years ago. His dearest friend had created a simple, soothing salve for her hands from tallow and crushed juniper. It was a scent tied inextricably in his mind to her kindness, her memory, and the terrible, broken promise he had made to her. He had thought it a phantom of his own grief, but today, it was real. "Reverend," Caleb said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced the mob. "What are you doing?" "God's work." "Caleb," Thorne shot back, annoyed. "Go back inside. This is no sight for you." But Caleb was already moving forward, drawn by the scent, his cane sweeping the ground. The crowd parted for him with a reluctant respect. He stopped a few feet from where the girl stood. The scent was stronger here, confirming the impossible truth taking shape in his mind. Grace's child. Tiva. As if guided by fate. Thorne, in his arrogant posturing, shifted his weight. His boot slipped off the amulet. The smooth river stone, dislodged, skittered across the hard-packed earth and came to rest directly against the tip of Caleb's worn leather boot. He froze, the slight weight against his foot as loud as a scream in his silent world. Slowly, deliberately, Caleb knelt. The crowd watched, breathless, as his weathered hands searched the ground. His fingers, sensitive from years of reading wood grain and navigating a world of darkness, brushed against the cool, smooth surface of the stone. He picked it up. His thumb immediately traced the symbol carved into its surface, a perfect circle, bisected by a single straight line. A tremor went through him. He had carved this symbol himself, a lifetime ago. It was a private joke between him and Grace, representing the town of Divinity, the circle, and the single straight path of decency they tried to walk through it. It was a secret made of wood and friendship. To feel it now, rendered in stone, in the hand of a girl who smelled of juniper, it was almost too much to bear. still kneeling. Caleb held the stone tightly in his fist. He did not rise. He addressed the unseen girl before him, his voice low, meant only for her. Yet every ear in the silent square strained to listen. "Your mother," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Did she ever speak of the man who built her a rocking chair from fallen pine?" Tiva's breath hitched. It was a story her mother had told her on cold nights, a story of a kind man with gentle hands. She said it was the only chair that didn't creak," she whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb's grip on the stone tightened. It was the confirmation he needed. He had built that chair. His questions had been a prayer, and her answer was its fulfillment. The promise was not broken. It had just been waiting. He pushed himself to his feet, turning his sightless eyes toward the stunned preacher, the scent of juniper, the story of the chair, and the sacred symbol in his hand coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. He took a deep breath, and he spoke the name that was both a memory and a prayer, a name that would shatter the town's ugly certainty. "Grace," he said. The voice was not loud, but it detonated in the silence. It was not a question. It was a recognition, an accusation, a verdict. Gasps rippled through the crowd, not of demonic fear, but of stunned, confused shock. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Grace? Did he say Grace?" Reverend Thorne's face went from a righteous flush to a pasty, bloodless white, as if he'd seen a ghost. Tiva was frozen. This blind stranger not only knew her mother's name, he knew her stories. He held her heart in his hand. In the fearful confusion he had wrought, Caleb Blackwood extended his hand, the one not holding the stone, in the girl's direction. It was an offer of sanctuary, a fulfillment of a promise long thought dead, and for the first time, Tiva reached out and took it, her fingers closing around his, completing a circle that had been left open for far too long. Tiva's world had narrowed to the space between the preacher's boot and Caleb's hand. His voice, speaking her mother's name, had been a shield. The amulet he held, now warm from his grasp, was a tangible link to a life she barely remembered. She took his hand. His skin was rough, the calluses of a carpenter still present despite the years, but his grip was steady. It was an anchor in the swirling sea of hatred. Caleb turned, his grip on her hand firm, and began to lead her away. He did not need to see the path. He knew it by heart. The crowd, which seconds before had been a single, monstrous entity, fractured into confused individuals. They stared, their mouths agape, their certainty washed away by a single word and a familiar carved stone. They did not part for the Comanche girl they called a devil. They parted for the ghost of the woman Caleb had named, Reverend Thorne. His face, a thunderous mask of humiliation and fury, remained rooted to the spot. He had lost control, and the bewildered silence of his flock was his punishment. He watched them go, his hand clenching and unclenching, a promise of future venom. Caleb's home was a small, neat cabin at the edge of town, set back from the road and shaded by a lone cottonwood. The walk was short, but it felt like a journey across a continent. Tiva felt the burn of 100 pairs of eyes on her back. Caleb seemed to feel nothing but the texture of the path beneath his feet and the small, trembling hand in his. Inside, the cabin was a world of stark order. The air smelled of clean pine, old books, and the faint, lingering scent of juniper. A simple cot was made with military precision. A table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the single room, their surfaces wiped clean. Every object had its place, a map laid out in the darkness of Caleb's mind. It was a silent, peaceful fortress against the chaos they had just escaped. He guided her to one of the chairs. "Sit," he said gently, finally releasing her hand. He placed the amulet on the table between them, a silent testament. He then moved with a slow, certain grace to a water pump in the corner, his hand finding the handle without hesitation. The rhythmic creak and splash of water was the only sound. He brought her a tin cup filled to the brim. Tiva drank, the cool water soothing a thirst she hadn't realized was so deep. She watched him over the rim of the cup, her survival instincts warring with the impossible hope rising in her chest. "You knew her stories," Tiva said, her voice a raw whisper. It wasn't a question. Caleb sat in the chair opposite her, his sightless eyes aimed in her direction. "I knew her," he corrected softly. "Grace was my friend, my only friend. In the end, she lived where this town's charity ended and the wilderness began. She saw people, not their skin. She saw the good in them, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." He paused, his hands resting on the table, inches from the stone. "She wasn't Comanche. She was a white woman who fell in love with a Comanche man, a good man. This town, Thorne's father before him. They drove him away, called him a savage. But Grace stayed. She was stronger than any of them." Tiva's heart hammered against her ribs. She hung on his every word, piecing together the faded tapestry of her own history. "Before the fire. Before I lost my sight," Caleb continued, a shadow of deep pain crossing his features. "Grace knew she was sick. The doctor gave her a few months. She was scared. Not for herself. For her daughter. A child she'd kept hidden. A secret she protected from the town's poison. A child named Tiva." He took a deep, shuddering breath, the weight of the next words immense. "She made me promise. On a night just like this one, she grabbed my hands and said, 'Caleb, if anything happens to me, you find my Tiva. She'll have no one. You keep her safe. Don't let them crush her spirit.' It was a sacred promise. I gave her my word. The name, the promise. It was all too much. A wave of dizziness washed over Tiva. Then the fire came," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a tormented whisper. "It started at the livery, but the wind was cruel that night. It took my workshop. It took my sight. And it took Grace. By the time I could walk again, by the time I learned to navigate this new darkness, you were gone. The trail was cold. The promise was broken." His head bowed, the confession a physical weight upon his shoulders. "I have lived with that failure every day since. Until today." His hand reached out, and his fingers found the amulet. "I carved the original symbol for her, on a scrap of pine, a small-cut foolish thing. I never knew she had it copied onto this stone for you. She made a secret into a legacy." Tears welled in Tiva's eyes, hot and silent. The story of her life, a mystery she had only known in fragments, was being laid bare by a blind man in a dusty cabin. She reached to her throat, her fingers finding only empty space where the stone should have been. Her heart ached with the loss, even as it was filled with this new, painful understanding. He had not just been a friend to her mother. He was the guardian of her memory, the keeper of a promise, and she was the living, breathing embodiment of his greatest regret. The weight of that broken promise no longer belonged to Caleb alone. It now rested on them both, a fragile, sacred inheritance in the heart of a town that had forgotten the meaning of grace. It was a bond forged not in friendship, but in shared grief, guilt, and the faint, persistent scent of juniper. The sanctuary of Caleb's cabin was short-lived. In divinity, fear left untended did not wither. It festered. Reverend Thorne, robbed of his public victory, retreated to his pulpit and began to stoke the flames of a more insidious fire. He didn't speak of devils now. He spoke of blasphemy. He twisted Caleb's act of recognition into an act of heresy, suggesting the blind man's grief had curdled his mind, that he had invoked the name of a sainted, dead woman to protect a heathen. He painted Tiva not as a demon, but as a temptation sent to test their resolve. A serpent whispering lies into the ear of a man lost in darkness. Whispers followed Tiva and Caleb like shadows. When Caleb went for supplies, the storekeeper who had known him for 20 years suddenly couldn't meet his sightless eyes. Prices were higher. Doors that were once open to him were now quietly shut. The town was turning on him, a slow, suffocating ostracism guided by Thorn's poisonous sermons. Tiva saw the change in Caleb. He grew more silent, the lines of grief on his face deepening into lines of worry. He would sit for hours, holding the smooth river stone, his thumb tracing the symbol as if trying to draw strength from it. She, in turn, found her own strength. She swept the cabin, mended his worn shirts, and made sure there was always a fire in the hearth when the evening chill set in. They moved around each other in a quiet, careful dance, two solitary souls learning the steps of a shared existence. The storm broke on the third night. A hard, cold rain lashed against the cabin, drumming on the roof like angry fists. It was well past midnight when a heavy pounding came at the door, a sound too aggressive to be a neighbor in need. Caleb rose from his cot in an instant, his body tense. "Stay back," he whispered to Tiva, who was already on her feet, her heart hammering. He made his way to the door, his cane left by the hearth. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt. "A message for the blasphemer!" A slurred voice roared from outside, thick with whiskey and righteousness. A rock shattered the single window of the cabin, showering the floor with glass. Tiva stifled a scream. Another rock slammed against the door, the wood groaning in protest. They weren't trying to get in. Not yet. They were terrorizing them, reminding them of their isolation. "Thorn sent you," Caleb shouted, his back pressed against the door. The only answer was mocking laughter, which was then joined by other voices. "The savage's pet," another voice sneered. "Come out and pray with us, blind man." Tiva, her fear momentarily eclipsed by fury, grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace. It was heavy and solid in her hands. She moved to stand beside Caleb, a silent, defiant shadow. He could not see her, but he felt the shift in the air, her warmth and her resolve beside him. He put a hand back, gently touching her arm, a silent command to wait. "You've delivered your message," Caleb called out, his voice ringing with a cold authority that surprised even himself. "Leave this place, now." "Or what, old man?" the first voice taunted. "You'll preach us to death?" The laughter faded. A new sound filled the night, the unmistakable, wet, slurping sound of something being poured against the base of the cabin. Kerosene. The sharp, oily stench seeped under the door, a smell that sent a bolt of pure, primal terror through Caleb. It was the smell of the fire that had stolen his world. The past and present collided. He was no longer in his cabin. He was back in his burning workshop, choking on smoke, the screams of dying animals in his ears, the memory of Grace's frantic face as he'd last seen her flashing in his mind's eye. His breath caught in his throat. The promise he had made to her wasn't just about keeping Tiva safe. It was about protecting her from this, from the fire of hatred that had consumed so much of his life. The footsteps outside receded, their work done. A final, chilling threat hung in the rainy air. "The Lord's fire cleanses all sins. Caleb, think on that." The threat was clear. They had not lit the fire tonight, but they had made a promise that they would. As the rain continued to fall, washing the kerosene away for now, Caleb and Tiva stood in the dark, shattered cabin. The fragile peace was gone, replaced by the certainty that the whispers had turned to threats, and the threats would soon turn to flames. The night of terror left a scar on the cabin and on Caleb's soul. The scent of kerosene lingered, a ghost that mocked the peaceful aroma of pine. He knew they couldn't stay, but to flee would be to break his promise all over again, to let Thorn and his mob win. The answer, he felt, was not in running, but in remembering. The amulet was a piece of the past, but it felt incomplete. He needed to understand why Thorn feared it so much, why he had been so desperate not only to take it, but to desecrate it. He threw it away, Caleb said the next morning, his voice distant. After we left, I heard him tell the marshal he'd disposed of the heathen idol. Where? Tiva asked, her voice low. There's only one place this town disposes of things it hates. Caleb replied grimly. The ravine, the town dump. The ravine was a deep gash in the earth a mile north of town, a place of rot and refuse, buzzing with flies. It was also the place where the debris from the Great Fire had been cast years ago, charred timbers, melted glass, and the ashes of his former life. He had not been back since. The journey was a perilous pilgrimage. Caleb, guided by Tiva's quiet directions, navigated the treacherous, uneven ground. She described the path, the rocks, the dips in the earth, her voice a calm counterpoint to the storm of memories raging in his mind. For Tiva, it was an act of desecration to search for a sacred object amidst filth. For Caleb, it was a descent into his own personal hell. As they reached the edge of the ravine, the stench hit them, a foul mix of decay and damp ash. Tiva's eyes scanned the vast expanse of rubbish, a nearly impossible task. It could be anywhere, she whispered, her hope dwindling. But Caleb was not looking for the amulet. He was listening. His memory of the fire was a chaotic hell of heat and smoke. But one detail now surfaced with chilling clarity. In the moments before the roof of his workshop collapsed, he remembered hearing the frantic shouts of men, not firemen, but others. He had smelled whiskey on their breath even through the smoke. And he had heard one voice, younger but unmistakable, slice through the chaos. It's done. The deed is signed. It was the voice of a young Gideon Thorn. He had always believed the fire was an accident, a stray spark from the livery. But now, standing at the edge of this mass grave of memory, the truth began to dawn. It wasn't an accident. It was an act of violent opportunity. A cover. The deed? Caleb murmured, the words tasting like ash. Grace owned her land outright, a deed signed by the town's founder. She showed it to me once. She kept it in a small, fire-resistant lockbox. He turned his sightless eyes toward Tiva. The fire wasn't just a fire. Tiva, it was a theft. They used the chaos to steal her land, the one thing of value she had. They murdered her for a piece of paper. The revelation hung between them, horrifying and absolute. The town of Divinity was not just built on prejudice, it was built on a foundation of murder and lies. Thorn's hatred for Tiva and the amulet wasn't just religious zealotry. It was the desperate fear of a man protecting a guilty secret, a secret his family had killed to keep. Suddenly, Tiva gasped. "Caleb," she said, her voice trembling as she pointed, tucked beneath a pile of rotting canvas. Something caught the light. It wasn't the smooth river stone. It was a corner of blackened metal. Together, they dug it out. It was a small, heavy lockbox, warped and scarred by intense heat. The lock had been broken. With trembling hands, Tiva lifted the lid. Most of the contents had been turned to ash, but one small, folded piece of parchment, tucked into the very bottom corner, had been miraculously shielded from the worst of the flames. It was scorched and brittle, but it was intact. It was the deed. And as Tiva carefully unfolded it, she saw something else tucked inside, something Caleb had never known about. It was a second document, a legal certificate of marriage, officially filed with the county circuit judge a month before the fire. A marriage between Grace and Tiva's father. A marriage that made Tiva not just the daughter of an outcast, but the legitimate, legal heir to the land on which half of divinity now stood. The amulet was not the key. The land was. And they had just found the map. The walk back to the cabin was silent, the weight of the scorched documents in Tiva's hands far heavier than any stone. The truth had not set them free. It had imprisoned them in a more dangerous reality. They were no longer just a blind man and an outcast girl. They were a threat to the entire power structure of divinity, to the land and legacy of its most powerful family. To flee now would be a death sentence. Thorn would hunt them to the ends of the earth to protect his secret. Back in the cabin, with the door bolted, Tiva carefully laid the deed and the marriage certificate on the table. In the dim light, Caleb ran his sensitive fingertips over the brittle edges of the paper, feeling the heat-sealed texture, reading the story of the fire. Heir, Caleb breathed, the word full of awe and terror. He doesn't just hate you, Tiva. He fears you. You are the living embodiment of his family's sin. Tiva looked at the amulet, which lay beside the papers. She had thought it was her heart, a connection to her mother. But it was more. It was a decoy. Her mother, in her wisdom, must have known that men like Thorn would covet something they could see, something they could label as savage and heathen. She had given Tiva the stone as a visible target, a piece of misdirection to protect the far more valuable and far more dangerous secret of her true inheritance. The amulet was a mother's brilliant, sacrificial lie. It was this realization that finally broke through Tiva's grief. A cold, clear anger took its place. Her mother had not just been a victim. She had been a fighter, using the town's own prejudice as a shield for her daughter's future. Tiva would not let that sacrifice be in vain. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice no longer the whisper of a frightened girl, but the firm tone of a woman with a purpose. Caleb was silent for a long time, his head bowed. He could feel the walls of the cabin closing in, the scent of kerosene still a ghost in the air. The logical path was to take the documents to the county seat, to the law. But the law was a day's ride away, and Thorn would never let them get there. They would be found in a ditch, their proof turned to ash. Fighting him with his own weapons, violence, fire, is a losing battle, Caleb said finally, his voice resonating with a newfound clarity. We have to fight him with the one weapon he doesn't have, the one thing this town pretends to worship but has never truly seen. The truth, Tiva whispered. Yes, Caleb affirmed. But not whispered in a cabin or argued in a dusty office. It must be delivered in the heart of his power, in the one place he feels safest. He raised his head, his sightless eyes seeming to look right through the cabin walls, toward the steeple that dominated the town. We are going back to the church. The decision was terrifying, bordering on madness. It was walking directly into the lion's den. But it was also the only path that honored the memory of Grace. She had lived her life with quiet defiance. They would honor her with a final, public act of truth. Tiva looked at Caleb, at the resolve that straightened his stooped shoulders and erased the lines of fear from his face. She looked at the scorched papers, the proof of her identity, and she looked at the river stone, the symbol of her mother's love. She picked it up and, with steady hands, used a strip of leather from her own moccasin to tie it back around her neck. It was no longer just a memento. It was her armor. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Caleb said. "Sunday morning, when all of divinity is gathered to hear him speak of sin, we will give them a sermon on grace." Sunday morning broke cold and clear. The church bell tolled, its solemn, clanging notes calling the faithful of divinity to worship. It was a sound of routine, of piety. But today, it sounded to Caleb and Tiva like a drumbeat before a battle. They walked together down the main street, a sight that brought the town to a dead halt. The blind man, dressed in his threadbare Sunday best, and the Comanche girl, the Riverstone amulet resting proudly against her chest. They did not look like victims. They looked like prophets. They did not enter the church with the rest of the congregation. They waited outside, hidden in the alley across the street, listening as the pews filled and the opening hymns were sung. They waited until they heard Reverend Thorne's voice rise, his sermon beginning with the familiar cadence of fire and brimstone. He was talking about the serpent in the garden, the insidious nature of temptation that can rot a town from the inside out. Everyone knew who he was talking about. At that moment, Caleb squeezed Tiva's hand. "Now," he whispered. They crossed the street and walked up the steps of the church. Caleb pushed the heavy doors open. They did not slam, but they opened with a deep groan that cut through the reverend's sermon. Every head in the church turned. A collective gasp filled the sanctuary as Caleb and Tiva stepped inside and stood at the back, framed by the bright morning light. Thorne stopped mid-sentence, his face contorting into a mask of pure fury. "This is a house of God," he thundered. "You are not welcome here. You defile this sacred place." "Do we, Reverend?" Caleb's voice, calm and powerful, filled the cavernous space. He began to walk slowly down the central aisle, Tiva at his side. The congregation shrank back from them as if they carried a plague. "I am a blind man. Friends," Caleb said, addressing the silent pews. "I cannot see your faces. I cannot see the color of a person's skin. I cannot see the clothes they wear or the house they live in. My world is darkness. And in that darkness, I have learned to see other things." He stopped directly in front of the pulpit, forcing Thorne to look down on him. "I see the truth, and the truth is that this town, this church, is blind. You have been led by a man who preaches of sin to cover his own. You have cast out the very grace you claim to worship. Lies. Blasphemy," Thorne shrieked, his composure shattering. "Is it a lie that your father used the Great Fire to conceal the murder of a woman named Grace?" Caleb's voice rang out, sharp as a rifle crack. A wave of murmurs swept through the church. "Is it a lie that he stole her land deed, the very land your house is built on?" He turned his sightless eyes to the congregation. "I have no proof to show you. I cannot hold up a piece of paper for you to see. I can only give you my testimony. A testimony of a promise I made to a dying woman. The testimony of a man who was there." He then turned back to Thorne. "But you, Reverend, you can see. And I wonder what you see when you look at this girl." It was Tiva's cue. With a courage she didn't know she possessed, she stepped forward. She held the scorched marriage certificate in one hand and the deed in the other. She did not speak. She simply held them up for the congregation to see. They were too far away to read the words, but they could see the official seals, the scorched edges, the undeniable authenticity of aged, damaged documents. "Her name is Tiva," Caleb declared, his voice resonating with the force of absolute conviction. "She is not a savage. She is not a devil. She is the daughter of grace. She is the legal, rightful heir to the land your preacher's family stole. Look at her. Look at the proof in her hands. Who is the serpent in this garden now? The silence that followed was absolute. The congregation was no longer looking at Tiva with hatred or fear. They were looking at Reverend Thorn, their eyes filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. They were finally seeing him, not as a man of God, but as the son of a thief and a murderer. His hypocrisy was laid bare, illuminated not by heavenly light, but by the simple, unadorned truth spoken by a blind man. Caleb had used his own darkness as a weapon, forcing them all to finally open their eyes. Reverend Gideon Thorn stood trapped in the pulpit, the silence of his congregation a more damning verdict than any shout. The authority he had wielded like a club had crumbled into dust. His face, drained of all color, was a mask of disbelief and primal fear. He looked from the damning papers in Tiva's hands to the sea of accusing faces that had, moments before, been his devoted flock. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. There were no scriptures to twist, no lies left to tell. The town marshal, a portly man named Miller who had always deferred to the reverend, slowly rose from his pew at the back. He did not draw his gun. He simply walked down the aisle, his heavy footsteps echoing the finality of the moment. He stopped at the base of the pulpit, looked up at Thorn, and spoke in a quiet, weary voice. "I think you need to come with me. Reverend, we have a lot to talk about." Justice, when it came, was not a storm of violence. It was a quiet, somber turning of a page. Thorn did not resist. He descended from the pulpit a broken man, all the fire and brimstone extinguished, leaving only the empty shell of a hypocrite. As he was led out of the church, no one said a word. They simply watched, their faces a mixture of shame, pity, and a profound, unsettling relief. In the silent aftermath, as the townspeople began to file out of the church, avoiding eye contact with each other and especially with the two figures at the front, a new reality settled over Divinity. The foundation of their town was not stone and faith, but blood and deceit, and the road to redemption would be long and paved with the hard stones of truth. Caleb and Tiva did not leave. There was nowhere else to go. Tiva, with the help of the marshal and the weight of the law, laid claim to her inheritance. It was not a grand house, but the small plot of land her mother had owned, the place where her life had begun. The people of Divinity watched, their fear of her slowly, painfully, transforming into a reluctant respect. She was not just a Comanche girl, she was a part of their history, a living reminder of their deepest sin and their only possible path toward grace. Caleb remained by her side, not as a protector, but as family. His broken promise had been mended, his long penance at an end. He had found his way out of the darkness, not by regaining his sight, but by helping others to see. The seasons turned in Divinity. The story of the blind man's testimony became a quiet legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children. Tiva's presence was a gentle but constant challenge to the town's conscience. She did not preach forgiveness, nor did she demand apology. She simply lived, tending her mother's small garden, her quiet dignity a more powerful sermon than any Thorn had ever delivered. People began to greet her, first with a hesitant nod, then with a quiet "ma'am," and eventually with a simple, revolutionary "Tiva." The West was a land of harsh judgments and swift violence, a place where fear could easily be forged into a weapon. But it was also a place of vast, quiet spaces where the truth, once planted, could take root in the most stubborn soil. It was a landscape that could swallow a person whole, but it could also offer a chance for a new beginning, not by erasing the past, but by facing it with courage. In the heart of Divinity, a town had lost its false god, and, in doing so, had taken its first, faltering step toward earning its name. For in the unforgiving light of the West, true grace is not found in a church or a book. It is found in the difficult, necessary act of seeing the humanity in another's eyes.